Judges Corner is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com and gatheringmagic.com. Support our show by visiting both websites. Now it's time for Judges Corner with David Green.
Welcome back to Judges Corner. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the word targeting. So targeting is a very specific word in Magic that means whenever you play a spell or ability with the word target in it, you select an appropriate card, object, zone, player, or the like that's appropriate for the spell, and that target is going to be the affected thing by the spell or ability. Targeting is very specific. A card only targets if it says the word target in its text, barring a few older cards that don't actually say the word target, but have target in the Oracle text. So there are a few cards that don't specifically target. For example, things like Clone select their creatures when they go and resolve, or Slaughter Games selects a card as it's resolving, or Supreme Verdict just destroys everything indiscriminately as it goes and resolves. Also, whenever you play a card with a target, it has to have a legal target when you're playing it and when it's going to resolve. But the thing that's important about when you play it is you can't even play the spell if there are no legal targets to select when you cast it. So let's take a look at an example of that. So in this example, we have a Huntmaster of the Fells, and our opponent wants to play an Ancient Grudge to keep it from transforming. But there are no artifacts on the battlefield. Unfortunately, you have to have a legal target to cast a spell, otherwise you can't even play it from your hand. So the Huntmaster will transform and turn into a Ravager of the Fells. In our next example, we have an Assassin Strike targeting our opponent's Shamble Shark, and our opponent responds with Ranger's Guile to give it hexproof. Assassin Strike will then be countered when it goes to resolve for having an illegal target, and none of its effect will happen. This includes our opponent discarding a card. But let's say that instead of Assassin Strike, we play a Feeling of Dread targeting two Shamble Sharks, and our opponent responds with a Ranger's Guile giving one of them hexproof. When that happens, one of the Shamble Sharks will be tapped and the other won't since it has hexproof because the spell does as much as it can. A spell will try to do as much as it can as long as one of its targets are still legal. If all of its targets are illegal, the spell will be countered by game rules. So now let's look at some things like Restoration Angel's ability that says you may exile target creature. A lot of players get confused with this because they think that they don't actually have to select a target, but you do have to select a target for every instance of the word target as long as there is a legal target that you can select. So let's say a popular example was Phantasmal Image, and you had a Phantasmal Image on the battlefield copying a non-angel, and you play Restoration Angel. You have to select that Phantasmal Image, which will unfortunately kill it, even though you may fully intend not to blink it. This is because you have to select a target for every instance of the word target. But one that's more advantageous would be with Angel Serenity. Let's take a look at that example. So in this example, we have Angel Serenity, which has very similar wording to Restoration Angel. You may exile up to 3 target creatures from the battlefield or any graveyard. And when you go to resolve this effect, you have the option of exiling them or not at the resolution of the effect. So let's say you play that, you select 3 of your own cards in your graveyard, and your opponent responds by playing Murder, hoping to effectively exile the 3 selected creatures forever. Well, when the exile effect goes to resolve, you then have the option of exiling those cards or not. You can't pick or choose and say, oh, I want 1 to be exiled and 2 not to. You have to either select them all or none of them. But when the effect goes to resolve, you do have the option, since it is a may ability, of resolving the effect or not. So what about some cards that seem like they don't target but actually do? Such as whenever you cast an aura spell and you target a creature when it's put onto the stack, or a permanent or whatever you're trying to enchant, and it enchants it when it goes to resolve. Or an equipment ability that you activate to equip to a target creature you control. Those all target, even though you don't really see the word target in their text. It is written in the rules text, though. And what about some cards that make those cards not target? In our next example, Bruna. So when Bruna's effect triggers, she takes all of the enchantments and just attaches them to her. But they never actually target her when they go to do this. This is because auras only target when they're cast and put on the stack. Otherwise, they just simply attach upon resolution and never actually select a target. Another thing worth mentioning with Bruna would be whenever those enchantments go to attach, if she couldn't normally be a legal choice for that aura, it doesn't attach, such as a card that says enchant a land or enchant a player. Those can't be attached to Bruna. So I already kind of covered this, but I want to hit it some more, and that's cards with multiple examples. For example, Into the Core, which says exile 2 target artifacts. You have to pick one artifact and then another artifact. They can't be the same artifact. And with Marshall's Glory, which says target creature gets +3/+0 and target creature gets +0/+3. With that, you actually can pick the same creature for both targets because there's two instances of the word target. Those two cards kind of interact differently with Spellskite, but we'll get into that towards the end of the episode. And finally, there's a rule that says spells can't be the target of themselves. So that's important with trying to redirect a counterspell to target itself. You can't do that. But there is a cool trick around that. Let's take a look at that in our next example. Here we have a cancel being played on some generic spell. And you really want to stop it, but you don't have a counterspell of your own. But you do have a redirect. When you play the redirect, you can't redirect the counterspell to itself, but you can redirect it to the redirect. So when this happens, redirect becomes the target of counterspell. Redirect finishes resolving and then is put into the graveyard. Counterspell goes to resolve, and its target is now illegal. So the counterspell is countered by game rules and put into the graveyard, effectively countering a counterspell with a non-counterspell. So now that we've looked at how cards can change targets or choose new targets, let's take a look at some rules based around that and go down that list really quick. So first you have, if you can't change it, you don't. And what I mean by that is, if you have a card that destroys target land, and you want to redirect it to a non-land artifact you control, you just can't do that. No change will occur, nothing really happens there. Next you have change the targets, and what that'll do is it'll change all of the targets or none of them. Then we have change A, which will change one of the targets selected. And finally, change any targets. And what that'll do is change any number of the targets ranging from none of them to all of them and everything in between. One last thing worth covering is that you can always choose to redirect the target to the same thing it was originally targeting if you want to for whatever reason. So before we move any further, let's take a look at a very common redirecting creature that causes a lot of confusion, Spellskite. Spellskite is a bit of a confusing creature because it can actually target spells or abilities that don't have the word target in them. It just doesn't do anything when the spell goes to resolve. Spellskite can target things that couldn't be redirected to Spellskite, like destroy target land to Spellskite. But when that ability goes to happen, the change never occurs because Spellskite isn't a land. But if Spellskite goes to change a spell such as murder to target Spellskite and that ability resolves changing it to Spellskite, if Spellskite gets shroud or hexproof afterwards, Spellskite will be an illegal target for the spell and that murder spell will do nothing to Spellskite. So that basically concludes targeting for this episode. Now let's take a look at some questions that have been asked by our viewers. Snap Tactics asked us our first question, which was, if they play a Vexing Devil and they have an Experiment 1 on the battlefield, but the opponent decides to take the 4 damage from Vexing Devil, does the Experiment 1 evolve? The Experiment 1's effect will trigger when the Vexing Devil enters the battlefield, but the Vexing Devil will be in the graveyard before Experiment 1 evolves. But when the Experiment 1's trigger does go to resolve, we see with last known information, talked about in an earlier episode, that the Vexing Devil was big enough to make the Experiment 1 evolve. And we use this last known information in order to answer the questions that Experiment 1 asks, making the Experiment 1 evolve, giving it a +1/+1 counter, and making it a 2/2. TJ asks, if they have a Domri Raid on the battlefield and they use its second ability to make 2 target creatures fight, and one of the 2 creatures becomes an illegal target, what happens? Well, because one of the creatures is an illegal target, the effect will end up doing nothing because it has nothing to fight. So, if you have any questions of your own, make sure to send them to judgescorner@gatheringmagic.com. And until next time, thanks for targeting this episode. Make sure to keep choosing Gathering Magic and have fun.